Hey, everybody. Welcome to our first virtual edition of our ongoing monthly author series, which we usually do in conjunction with our great friends at the local Hanley Library here in downtown Winchester. Of course, the current state of affairs has made intimate gatherings impossible. As the executive director and founder of 1455, I not only want to continue to provide this programming, but as I said in my conversation with Barbara Dickinson yesterday from Hanley, I think this technology affords us an opportunity to do some things we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. That said, it was a little bit unfortunate for a variety of reasons that my good friend Justen Ahren was going to be in town last weekend. And of course, we weren't able to do that. But he and I discussed and agreed that we could and should let the show go on. And I can't think of a better person to kick off this virtual part of our series than my friend Justen, who I'll introduce in a second. In terms of backdrop, and he and I can talk about this a little bit. I first met Justen 5 years ago when he was running the Noepe Center for Literary Arts at Martha's Vineyard, which he founded and ran for over a decade. We can talk about how we met and how his dream kind of led to this dream. So I want to say at the outset, without Justen's example, what we're doing here at 1455 might not ever have come to pass. So it's with tremendous gratitude and appreciation that I introduce him. Let me do that, and then I'll bring him on the screen. Martha's Vineyard Poet Laureate Justen Ahren is the author of a previous collection of poems entitled A Strange Catechism. He, as I mentioned, is the founder and director of Noepe Center for Literary Arts and the Italy Writing Workshop. He's also a photographer and musician. His current project, A Machine for Remembering, from which the photos that are included in the book are drawn, focuses on refugees and refugee landscapes. To read more of his poetry and view some of his photographic work, you can visit him online at justenahren.com. Follow him on Instagram and Facebook at Justen Ahren. Justen, welcome. It's a delight to connect with you and talk to you in this virtual environment.
Hey, Sean, what an honor for me. Thank you very much. It would only be better if I could see you in person and be sitting across a table from you.
Well, likewise. I mean, let's just jump right in because there's a lot of meat on the bone. But as you know, and I hope by the time we're done, a lot of people watching this will know your poetry is very moving, very meaningful, and also very of the moment. And I want to spend some time today talking about what inspires you. But I think it would be also appropriate to begin. I think many of us in the Gen X demographic have jokingly but truthfully mentioned that with this social distancing and lockdown, we were built for this. We grew up in an analog world. We're used to being alone and having isolation. But I think you, maybe more than anyone I know, is really ideally situated to grapple with this kind of new normal because you have given many talks, which I have had the pleasure of seeing, talking about cultivating a daily writing practice. So I would love you to talk a little bit about that and how that came to be, but also how that has and hasn't changed now that we are all being forced to try to cultivate multiple daily practices.
Right. Well, I'll say I've just, to try to keep some semblance of normalcy, I have, tried to keep a routine that I've had before this started, which involves, meditating and writing in the morning for several hours. And so I haven't varied that too much. The only thing that has varied in that I'm sleeping a little later than I'm accustomed to when I'm, in my normal life. But I felt like it has been important for me to try to continue with my routine. I function best, I think, as a writer and as a creative person with a little bit of pressure. And by pressure, I mean some kind of a container. Otherwise, I'd be all over the place. If I had infinite time or infinite, no responsibilities, I might not get anything done. So I've always functioned best, I think, is with a little bit of pressure of a time constraint. And so I've tried to just keep that on, keep a little pressure on myself and say, the quarantine, knock on wood, isn't going to go on forever. I'm going to take advantage of this time. I'm also going to keep a little bit of pressure on myself. And even though I have more time at home than I normally would have, still going to kind of give myself this little container in which to write, try to be productive.
Good for you. I think, at a lot of the events and conferences that I've either sponsored or been to, a question that a lot of younger writers will ask is, talk to me about what a routine is and talk to me about deadlines. I'm curious if, and I think I know the answer, but talk to us about kind of the micro and macro of how you put those kind of pressures. Like, I think a lot of writers are always either working on or thinking about their next big project. But I think also when you break that down, big projects typically are comprised of miniature projects or the daily work you put in. But maybe talk a little bit more about, what kind of deadlines and what kind of pressure you put on yourself to keep productive.
Well, look, for years, I struggled as an artist. I suffered. Struggle would be an understatement. I suffered. I felt like I could only create when I was inspired. And so I'd kind of walk around in these lapses of days or weeks without really making anything. I didn't realize that the real secret for, one of the secrets of being creative and really to be abundantly so is that we have to go to work in a sense, like punching a clock, and even when we might not feel inspired, that we sit down and get to work. And out of that kind of rummaging and laboring, literally laboring, as you would dig a hole or, move a stone or whatever. I'm a landscaper as well. So I'm pulling from my gardening metaphors. But, in the way that we would labor over something like that we physically get ourselves seated and we bring our attention and our intention to the work at hand. And sometimes we already have a project going. A lot of times I do have at least a project, if not 2 or 3 going. And so, check in with myself, get myself seated, get myself prepared to, I said earlier that I meditate every day. That's one of the ways I prepare myself for my routine. One of the things I talk about when I go and teach or talk to groups is the importance of one developing their own routine. How do you get yourself to your seat? How do you prepare yourself physically, mentally? How do you take care of yourself to get in front of your screen or at your book or in a journal or whatever, however you choose to write? How do you get yourself there? It's one thing. It's hard to kind of sit and get ourselves to work. There are a lot of things we'd prefer to do. I sometimes would, I'd rather do the dishes than sit down and write what is kind of, clanking around in my brain. But really we have to kind of train ourselves and discipline ourselves. And once we can kind of get ourselves that channel to our seat, then the real work can begin at that point. But as I was saying, I struggled for years without being disciplined. And it wasn't until a friend of mine, now it's been a number of years, maybe 8 years, but a friend of mine challenged me. I'd gone out to breakfast with him and I was complaining about, my job. I don't have any time to write and I really want to write. And, he was basically like, Justin, cut the crap. If you really want to write every day. And I'm going to challenge you to write every day. And if you can't do it, then, give it up. It's a pipe dream and you're just using it as kind of an excuse. But I give him a lot of credit because he really challenged me to, kind of stop complaining that I didn't have time, set aside the time every day. And so part of that challenge was, he said, how much time can you devote to writing each day? And devote that time and check in. I'll check in with you, you check in with me, and I want to see that you can do it. And so I bit off a big chunk at first. I said, I'm going to do 2 hours. And I'm a family man. I have kids. I have a job. And but I said 2 hours, and I found those 2 hours at the beginning of my day, and I've stuck to that. That is, I've made that kind of work, and I've made that, I've carved out a sacred space that it's really non-negotiable. Nothing encroaches. I don't make coffee dates around that time. I don't, I don't schedule anything except that's when I sit and get to work.
So, that reminds me, and I think anyone that takes the practice seriously is in the habit of not only trying to write all the time, but of course we read all the time. And I can never get enough of interviews or even books on craft. And I always alternate between being inspired and intimidated when you see the real masters talk about their routines. But the theme, I'm talking about someone like Murakami who swims for 2 hours every morning and talks about how it's important not only to have the focus and the mental balance, but to be physically in shape. And I think that's an overlooked phenomenon. But just seeing how uh, everyone or many people, what works for some doesn't work for others, and there's no one way. One of the things that I really was inspired by, and I thought was really refreshing about how you've written about this, is in your essay that I remember first reading, many years ago. You talked about your grandmother and the daily practice, which, so some of your inspiration, I think, literally in terms of the work you do, the beautiful work with the land that you do, which I know is very important to feeding you literally and figuratively, but feeding your soul. But maybe talk a little bit about that essay and how the example of not just in terms of writing, but someone that is doing a job, and what the secret, it being what you alluded to, is you have to do it every day.
Sure. So my grandmother, to give you a little background, she was a dairy farmer for 50 years. If you don't know about dairy farming, and what it requires is you need to milk the cows 2 times a day, morning and evening. And so, and that is, you don't get Christmas off, you don't take Thanksgiving off, you don't get sick days unless you have somebody that can come in and do this for you. You go to work. And her example was that kind of, well, first of all, she loved it. She knew that she loved. This is what she wanted to do. This was her passion. And so an example of someone who had found what they really loved to do in their life, and she was fulfilled by that task, by that responsibility, by, I use the word devotion, by her devotion to that work of going to milk those cows. And the way she took on that work, I'd watch her take her milk buckets and the buckets she used to clean the udders of the cows. Because at this point, when I was younger, she was milking the cows by hand, and she had 50 cows. That's a lot of milking to do. But she would take the buckets and the warm water in the pails and the washcloths, and she would go stall to stall, and she would wash the udders and the teats, and then milk the cow and go to the next one and do the same thing, and just kind of repetitive process. And it was so physically taxing to her that over the course of her life, she ended up, stooped. And I think that was really from the carrying those heavy buckets of milk and water through the barn all the time. And so in that way, I kind of, I think that the work itself shaped her. And this essay kind of takes on this idea that, we do the work. Like I use the example of my grandmother going to work to the barn. She wears this path through her yard from her house to the barn. And I have worn on my keyboard, I've worn away the letters from typing, from working. And it's kind of, for me, it was this evidence visually of the number of times I've come to sit and to write. And that work, in the same way that my grandmother's milking and carrying these buckets kind of physically made her, that the writing in some way physically and emotionally and mentally, psychologically, spiritually shapes us. It's this kind of way that we bring our attention. I use that word a lot, and when I'm teaching, the way we pay attention. And I would watch my grandmother again do her work, and she could have been going about the work complaining, "Oh, this is so hard. I wish blah, blah, blah," all the things that a lot of us do. I do, I got to do this. But she seemed to do it with, it wasn't resignation. It was like a real sense of, like, she knew that this is what she loved to do, and it filled her. And so there was a joy in that. And I think that was my, big takeaway from her life was, not just the dailiness of what she did, because we could so easily get ground down by something like that, but the joy that she took from the work itself. And, as far as writing goes, it's not always easy to write. And for a long time, when I was saying I suffered, I didn't always find enjoyment in what I wrote. It was a struggle. And, I have learned to bring a sense of playfulness to the work, and not take it that it's always so serious and that I'm sitting down to write a masterpiece. But I love the sculptor Alberto Giacometti, and what he said. He worked every day, sometimes 10 hours a day on his sculpting. And one thing that he said in a documentary about him, he said he sculpts in order to learn how to sculpt. And I thought, wow, how could a master like that say some, all his life he's spent, and he's still at the end of his life saying that he's learning how to sculpt. And I think I took that to heart, thought about my writing. What if I sat every day to write and thought, I'm going to write in order to learn how to write, not sitting down as if I've already mastered anything. But what is this? I love language. How can I play with this? How can I learn more about putting these things together, these sounds together, these images together to create, to create something in a playful way that is, meaningful for me and hopefully communicates what is, what I'm trying to express.
Well, I love that, obviously, and I think particularly in America and in America today, I think we do a couple of things we do in ill service to is mystifying some of these things, which are actually relatively straightforward, but also kind of elevating, whether it's an athlete or a musician or a writer, this notion that there's mystical powers and you're touched and certainly there are some in all of those fields that have an unbelievable talent. But the more I've read, whether it's a Stephen King talking about exactly what you just said, he doesn't take any days off. So how humbling that is for someone at that level of success to take it that seriously, or someone like a Michael Jordan who had an unbelievable talent, but you read the interviews or see the documentaries, and it was a constant practice to get at that level. I think the thing that comes back is you do cultivate a sort of obsession. So I think where the herd gets thinned out a little bit is if you really don't enjoy it, there's not a whole lot of point. You still have a long road, and it's a ceaseless stream of rejection at times. But boy, if you're not enjoying the process itself, that's probably the first sign, I think, even more than talent, that this might not be a life that you're really cut out for.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's all in the process. If you're writing only for product, for what it's going to get you, and you're hoping that it's either, some financial success or it's awards or recognition or whatever, I don't, sure, go ahead for that. But I think that you've got to love the process. That's what you're engaged in 95% of the time, maybe more, 99% of the time. It's the process. And you're alone and you're doing that, right? Those other things, I think, the publication, the recognition, the community, any of those things, I think that we would hope to get out of the work, that is kind of a dream of it. I think those things come, but they only come through the work, from the, getting into that process. And I think what I didn't understand as a young writer and as a young artist is that the process was where the joy was. I missed that. I thought it was all lightning bolt and like, the idea has entered me, and but there's a lot of time that we're at work and it's mundane. But in order to get to what I have found is there is something that comes in that is mysterious and inexplicable, and that I can't explain where this image comes from or how anything happened, except that by sitting and getting to work, I've prepared ground for something to enter that is a gift or is a mystery or from a higher power, whatever it is. I don't even really care what the word is. It's just that I know that by sitting, and sometimes for a long time, that these things happen. That the universe, whatever, seems to kind of interject something on its own. And those are lovely, amazing ahas. Like, so glad that I sat here and did this, because this is what I've been rooting around for days or hours. And and that fills me with joy. And that is when we hit those. And maybe it's just that, it all sings. What we've been working on is singing, or the one metaphor we needed just to the kind of the linchpin or the keystone, whatever metaphor you want to use. We find it. I have a story in my first book, In a Strange Catechism. I was writing this poem, I was working on it for months. These last two couplets, I could not write it. I couldn't get it. It just always clanked, fell apart. I don't know, it just was hollow, never worked. And I was walking my dogs one day, which is part of my routine as well. In the afternoon, I take the dogs for a walk. And I'm walking the dogs, and suddenly those last two lines come into my head, perfectly formed in the way I had never been able to form them. If I hadn't been preparing the ground for them, I think, for all of that work, all of the trying the different configurations and syntax and everything, I don't think I could have gotten to the final couplet that I got, which, did come out of just kind of an inspired moment, walking the dogs, not really thinking about it at all. And it just came in, but I had to do all the work in order to lay the groundwork for that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, we all want to hit the game-winning shot, but I don't know if many of us, to belabor the sports analogy, want to practice shooting free throws in the rain 4 hours a day, like when you see these documentaries. And again, even the most talented athletes talk about their obsession with perfecting their craft so that when the moment comes, they were able to produce. I don't think it's a stretch at all. And I think exactly what you're talking about is, when you're and I've invoked this before, but one of my favorite descriptions of this process is the great jazz musician Charles Mingus had spent a lot of time in apprenticeship, unable to pay bills like so many jazz musicians then and now, but he talks in his autobiography about he was working series after series of mundane jobs that he hated, and he wanted that time to compose, but he had been doing it long enough that suddenly it clicked, and he realized, even when I'm not composing, I'm composing, because he was thinking about it all the time. So he was almost in a way able to train his mind to transcend whatever circumstances he was in, but he was able to lock in. And again, to me, there's a spiritual contentment and peace there, but I think it also speaks to the ugliness and the necessity of, you need to make it a priority, and it has to be your life. Otherwise, if you're not going to take it that seriously, how would you expect a reader at a literary magazine, an editor that's seeing hundreds of poems a day, if you haven't spent the time to make it sing? How dare you think that an editor or a reader coming to it blind is going to invest the time?
Yeah, very well said. If we feel like we have a gift or a talent for this, then honor it by working
Yeah.
it. I mean, Michael Jordan just didn't become Michael Jordan by being Michael Jordan. He, like you said, he practiced a lot, which is an interesting word, practice. It's used in sports. People go to baseball practice, football practice. It's used in music. I'm going to piano practice. I'm going to practice piano, whatever it is. It's not used in writing. Nobody says, I'm going to practice writing. And I find that very interesting. And I don't know if it comes from writers, because we, I don't know, we think we I don't know what, maybe it's just the way we hold ourselves in high esteem or low, I don't know. Or it's the idea that when you set something down on paper, it's kind of set in stone. So there's not really a room for, even though with, word processing, certainly that doesn't exist. We can rip things apart, move it all around, delete it and put it back in, and no problem. But I really think, and I've lobbied for this a lot in my own, teaching and working with people, is consider it practice. Again, as I said earlier, about learning to write, but I'm going to practice writing. It removes a lot of the pressure of that sentence that you just threw down on the page has to be perfect, or has to be earth shattering, has to win some kind of a literary award. Just practice. That's how you get good at it.
That's right. And of course, sometimes, when we're trying to shoehorn what we think is perfection and searching for that kind of white whale, it makes it more challenging, but B, allowing the happy accidents to happen, or having enough respect for the subconscious, I think is really where you step away from it either an hour or a year later and say, truthfully, I have no idea where that came from, and how humbling and beautiful that is. But I think, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but I've seen this said a number of different ways, but something along the lines of, the muse, will come, but she appreciates it if you meet her halfway. If you're already writing, it's a hell of a lot more likely that you're going to get inspired, or that something good's going to happen, as opposed to waiting for that lightning to strike. But I would be remiss both in this broader conversation, but also as this segue. I definitely want to talk a little bit about, because we've adequately covered. I think we could talk all day, and I would
Yeah.
certainly enjoy it, talking about craft, and I consider you a master and an expert kind of teacher, in terms of how you inspire others, and have really tried to pay it forward in terms of taking some of the hard lessons that you've learned and inspiring others to be productive. But the other key element that you really kind of reawakened in me is this real need for community, and how important, especially amongst writers, this solidarity and the ability to commiserate and inspire and inform, whether it's through conversation or breaking bread. But maybe talk a little bit about how Noepe came to be, and both what gave you that idea and also what you learned through doing that, and the work you continue to do.
Good. So Noepe is a literary arts center. Started out writer's residency, and then we added workshops a little bit later, on Martha's Vineyard, where I live, raising my family. I finished my MFA program at Emerson College in Boston, and I was back on the island, and just found myself about a year out of MFA and feeling like I really missed community. I really missed the writing community that I'd been part of in Boston. But I also knew I wanted to raise my family here on the vineyard. And so a lot of things went my way. I have a lot of wonderful, supportive people, friends, family in my life. And this one particular person had a space, and was able to get this space to invite writers to come. My idea really was just that I wanted to invite writers from wherever to Martha's Vineyard, give them this space and this time to create. And I wanted to have a meal with them. That was really my vision to start this, was that I was sitting at a large table with 8, 9, 10 writers, and we were talking about books, and we were talking about craft, and we were reading to one another, and we were sharing our work and supporting one another. And that was it. And from that simple thing, everything miraculously happened. I really feel like there were a lot of miracles along the way that it was meant to be. And, but what I found from that experience was how much we grow in community. There's a lot of responsibility that went along with having that space and having people come. But the amount of growth that could happen from having these different writers come and be in that space, and the sharing that took place, the lifelong friendships that developed, not just for me, but this community, exponentially grew. People would come, 9, 10 people at a time. They would leave. A lot of people would come back, but people would stay in touch outside, and they would start to develop their own writing groups or correspondence through emails, Facebook, and just kind of support one another. And so this community, really grew and set down roots elsewhere, and has kind of continued to support. People have continued to support one another through their experiences from their experiences here at Noepe. And for me, the most tremendous, I think one of the most tremendous gifts that it has given my life was that for the first time in my life, I felt like I had created something that people felt was a gift to their life. But all the time it was giving me back a gift. And this reciprocity was just ongoing, and it just kept building and building. And the more I gave, the more I got back. And that was a stunning kind of example of this law, I think, is a real law of the universe, is, you give and there's this reciprocity that happens, but you have to give. And I didn't know that. And that's why I say it was a tremendous lesson to my life. I had never felt so much community is love. I think there's a great equation between the two. It is, there's a lot of love in that, and that was the experience of it ultimately. I don't know how else to say that.
Well, I think what you just articulated is, and people watching now are going to get a very good sense. It speaks a lot about the type of person you are, and I think you're being, typically modest, in terms of the scope and beauty of what you created. But I lovingly and respectfully refer to you as the Godfather, in the
Yeah.
sense that this 1455 is neither a replacement nor facsimile of the Noepe experience. It really is a continuation in a lot of ways. But I've written about it on the 1455 site. For me, having been a grad student, early in my life, in my early 20s, and then really working for a couple of decades, cultivating as healthy a balance as possible of paying bills and carving out an artistic path. It wasn't until I came to Noepe, first as a 2-week resident, and then later when I had the wonderful opportunity that you provided to come up and spend an entire season there. What I didn't realize how much that community had been missing from my life. And it was that same feeling I remember so fondly about grad school, that excitement and the solidarity that's not based on, resume measuring or, snobbery or achievement, but just this real sense of what a small subsection of the entire population it is to have adults who are very serious about their craft, again, regardless of their level of expertise or accomplishment, but just people that care about the written word. And typically what I found, and I think what you're describing very clearly, is it's not that much of a coincidence that people that are very passionate about their craft tend to be very creative, generous, kind, intelligent people. So what I'm always appreciative of what you achieved and created was pulling together from a much larger community, this smaller, vibrant community of creative, intelligent, kind people, and then that builds micro communities within that. But what I saw at Noepe, and what I'm already seeing through 1455, is this notion that once people get a piece of that and a taste of that, it becomes very addictive, but in an entirely positive way. Because there's no awards, there's no money, there's nothing fake about it. So even though I'm a big fan of, we all should encourage and support each other, if not us, who's going to do it? Artists need to look out for each other. But I want to be clear that what we're talking about is not really like an adult day camp where everyone pat each other on the back. We're talking about some very genuine kind of solidarity. And yeah, I think that's something that's been overlooked. And to bring it full circle, sort of what I think, if there's I think there's a myriad silver linings that can come out of what we're dealing with right now as a country. But I think people are very hungry for content and community. And that's something that writers in general and people that have happened to be crazy enough to try to run a nonprofit arts organization are really intimately familiar with. But I always love, because you said it before, you talk about, you gave a lot, which I know, but you got a lot back.
Yeah. I also say it wasn't entirely an altruistic endeavor. It was selfish in a lot of ways. I just wanted to be around writers and creative people, and I always have. But I will say that aside from that, I think one of the things that motivates me to work with writers and to pull Noepe together, what did motivate me, in addition to just wanting to be around artistic people, was, growing up, I grew up in a small town. There weren't a lot of people that I knew who were writing or playing music or painting, or, and so I felt like what I was doing was, strange. And so I didn't have a lot of community growing up. I didn't have a lot of support. Nobody was encouraging me. Yeah, you should be a writer. That's a great idea. And so I think as I got older, it's just, I feel particularly passionate and drawn to help other people, to encourage them to do what my friend did for me, and challenge me, and challenging me to write daily, to become, the creative, more of the creative person that I was, feel like I'm here on earth to be. Yeah, so I feel particularly passionate about, when I meet people who are struggling to write or to create, that to support them either verbally through teaching, through pointing them to to books, to providing them space that I did at Noepe.
And that's a good enough segue. One of the things I've enjoyed, as a friend and fan of yours, is kind of this constant evolution. I frankly thought you were pretty fully formed when I got to know you, in 2015, 2016. But seeing some of the things you've been up to in the years since, I think you really I mean, you didn't rekindled, I guess is not strong enough a word, kind of wanderlust. But I'd love you to talk a bit about the adventure and experience that helped inform your latest book. And then we've got plenty of time. Talk about A Machine for Remembering, and then would love to hear you read some poems from that if you'd like.
Okay, thank you. So talk about not knowing what you're writing and just writing. A Machine for Remembering, the book that came out of really 3-4 years of writing. It started kind of when my friend challenged me to write daily, and sitting down and thinking, okay, now what do I do for 2 hours? How am I going to fill this? And writing, I don't know what to write. I don't have anything to say. In those early pages, which I've kept all of, I can look at them. I could see the germ, the little seed germinating for this book, what was to become this collection. Early on, I was doing, kind of groping around, but exploring ideas of exile, of displacement. Early on, thinking what that meant for me exclusively. Where, what am I displaced from? Memories, my grandparents who are no longer alive. I can't ever get back to them. I can't have conversations with them. The house where I grew up, I can't go back to that. That's no longer in the family. But that evolved, that kind of idea, those ideas, those themes evolved. I had been teaching in Italy, where I teach the workshops on daily writing practice, cultivating a daily writing practice. I've been going there for a couple of years, and I began photographing while I was there. And again, maybe this is just the way that I work. Not really sure what I was taking pictures of, but when I showed it to my friend who lives in Italy, just outside of Rome, he was like, "Oh, well, those are clothes that were left from these refugees that have been coming through, traveling through Italy to get further north in Europe." This was 2014, 2015, right at the beginning of the European kind of refugee crisis. And so over the next couple of years, I returned to Italy. I did some traveling within the country. I started to be more conscious of photographing these refugee routes through Europe, through Italy specifically. And then a few years ago, I decided to volunteer patrolling the beaches in Lesbos, Greece, to receive refugees who were coming by rafts and boats and things at night. And so I did that work with a Norwegian organization called A Drop in the Ocean. And there, I think I finally got this kind of thing that pulled all of the book together, which was I was able to, at night we patrolled this 10-mile stretch of beach from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. Then we would sleep for a few hours. And in the afternoon, we would work in a community center where we would serve food to the refugees who were already on the island living in the refugee camp. And the people who would come in and we'd serve a meal, we could sit and talk with. And it was there that I started to hear the stories and got to have conversations with individuals about their experience, where they were from: Afghanistan, Iraq, a lot from Syria. And these stories really coalesced around things that I'd already been writing in response to my travels and in response to what was coming over my news feed. These poems about war, about being a refugee, about exile. And so hearing those stories really began to, the poems then began to take shape, and the book began to take shape. And it's the book is like a narrative of poems. It's all poetry, but it unfolds like a narrative, a journey of told through one person's perspective. So there's a lot of story behind how all those transitions took place from, writing um, from a first person I, me, Justin the writer, to, evolving it into, someone a character to speak through. But anyway, yes, that is the non-elevator version of what the book, how the book came about.
Well, what I love about that story in particular and the way you tell it, Justin, is that, what you're really describing is also, kind of, again, circling back on some of the themes we've touched on, the notion that, so even though you had spent a lot of time cultivating and developing this very rigorous and spiritual practice, um, one still needs to instigate adventures. One still needs experience. One needs to respond to the events that are happening around them. And I celebrate your ability as a sensitive person and artist to kind of intuitively understand that what you were, seeing was feeding things you were already thinking about. And then we can really get into some kind of mystic, what is the world preparing us for? And then, of course, I think both of us believe that, but in more practical terms, having the tools that maybe 10 years before, even if you had a remarkable experience like that, you may not have been, in the position to fully harness that amazing energy and creativity that was getting inspired. But you've given us the description. Please read a few of the poems if you'd care to. I know I'd love to hear you read them.
Sure. I thought I would choose a few that I don't often read because I wanted to give them bring them to light a little. Even when I do my readings, I don't often read them. And I guess I had to ask myself why. I won't bother answering that why here, but so this is one I thought I would read. And I had talked about Alberto Giacometti
Yes.
earlier. And we could have a whole nother conversation on the way books evolve and how they're made. But Giacometti early in the process played a prominent role. His figures, these kind of long, emaciated figures. And even when I changed the idea of the book, and when I started to know that I was going to write about more, about refugees coming from Syria, the fact that I had already done so much research and written so much about these sculptures and Giacometti's work, they had a place in this. The figures themselves, if people are familiar with them, they're emaciated, they're kind of nervous, and to me they kind of embodied this existential, the existential crisis of being without home or displaced or harassed from country to country. And so so the titles stayed. Giacometti's Figures is the title of several poems in here, and they're just numbered after that. So this is Giacometti's Figures number 3. I try, but I can't forget the small room above the avenue. 3 soldiers standing very near and menacing. I can't tell where they end and I begin, so immediately I start to sketch them in the room, in the space between us, in order to shape the trembling around and within, to see finally that we are not separate, but complete, a haunting.
Wow. And as I'll interject briefly that I remember probably in 2016 when the working title was Giacometti's Figures, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. Okay. So I feel privileged to have literally seen how that work evolved. And again, everyone forgive me, but I think it's worth belaboring. We keep circling back around, but I think it's to me, it's a very kind of inspiring proof that the work's always in progress. And that's, again, both intimidating and inspiring that we need to keep working at it, but then things that we didn't initially intend to do take on perhaps, entirely different or larger vistas. And the work you've produced, I think, although I think it would have worked beautifully with a more narrow focus, what you eventually pulled together just has such a more sweeping kind of human, timeless aspect to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important for me anyway, as an artist, to acknowledge that I don't always know what I'm doing, and I don't even always know what the work wants to be. And I'm trying to make room for these things, individual poems, but then the book as a whole to be, to kind of allow it to be what it wants to be and not control it. Just because I had an idea doesn't mean it was the best idea.
Yeah.
I grew as a person over the 3-4 years that it took to write the book. I grew, my experiences changed, my writing changed. And so the book had to change, I felt, in order to be the book, the end book. And so I say that, just encouraging other writers to allow yourself space to grow and allow work to grow. If you can, if you can give up some of that control, and maybe it turns out, to be, to trust too, that things might be suggesting themselves, and to you kind of honor what might be working its way in order to make something that is bigger or better than you knew. So
I think something that perhaps only artists fully understand and embrace is that the notion of surrender does not have any negative connotations, and in fact often can be a pathway to something much more powerful than a single mind's capable of conjuring up.
yeah, thank you. Beautiful. Surrender. Yeah, it's a good word to use. So this other poem I wanted to read, or another one I wanted to read, is one thing that became clear to me as a kind of an objective in making this book was, there's a lot of violence and there's a lot of very difficult imagery in it, with people who have been shot and people in the streets. And a lot of these things were taken directly from stories that I heard from refugees that I talked to in the camp. But one thing that was really important was that I tried to bring in love as well, and that something hopeful and intimacy. So I wanted to see how well I could bring together violence and intimacy into poems, even into the same line. And that was a very important kind of, just, it's not a project really. It was just important to me to see how I could do it. Even if I could say the words "I love you" in a poem and make it work, because that is, I feel like, almost an impossible task to make it felt. And so to bring intimacy and violence close together in these poems and in this book was really, I wanted to know whether I could do it, and whether it would be effective, whether people would feel it, whether I could feel it. And so I wanted to share this poem because I think it is an example of that at work. It's called Fragment. Over the rubble of your shoulders, in the smolder of my eyes, through the silence of curfews, what we seek is nothing to feel ashamed of. To remain human, night after night, we find one another as leaflets of sorrow drop in the dark. We devote ourselves to the stations of zippers, to dressing and undressing, while markets are bombed, ending conversations between women in line for bread, we kiss. While men are stolen and dragged from their beds, hooded and chained in puddles of excrement, wires clipped to their nipples, we make a quiet love in the dark.
So, one of the things I really admire about your work is there's a constant kind of tension between the sensual and the brutal, both in the landscape and in the contours of kind of the human heart. And in this collection, you're really able to grapple with, I don't know if it gets any heavier, right, in terms of content and subject matter. And to me, one of the signs of a very mature poet is to neither sensationalize nor trivialize these things that are, often reduced to statistics and newspaper articles. And there's very little way for us to feel an immediacy with this unbelievable suffering. I can't help but think another potential silver lining from some of this collective struggle that we're experiencing now as a world is that maybe this will reawaken some empathy, amongst us. And that's certainly a time for poetry. Maybe talk a little bit about how difficult it was or is for you to see things that I would imagine on one hand are very pretty stark and easy to describe, but to describe poetically or to have the audacity to create poetry out of is no small feat.
Well, I don't know. This book I gave up on. I almost gave up on, because I didn't know if I could do it justice, and I also had reservations about trying to speak for anyone else's experience. And even after it was published, I still think I had reservations about that, but I do think as artists, I don't know, I'm not really prepared to talk about that, but
Yeah.
I do feel like a big part of it was to be able to go and to provide and to be of service during the creation of this gave me whatever permission I felt like I didn't have before doing that, to write these poems. I felt like going and being of service, not just helping people who were coming ashore, giving them water and clean, warm clothes and, medical attention at the moment of arrival, but then, post that, to be able to sit with them, have a meal, and listen to their stories. To be able to provide that service gave me whatever permission I needed to be able to write about some of these things. And I asked the people too that I was talking to. I told them I'm a writer and I was working on a book, and would they mind if I used parts of what they were telling me in my work. And I got those permissions, so I don't feel like I was just taking advantage of anyone's story without them knowing about it. The hardest part for me was after the writing, that I did wade into some material that was dark and heavy, and then the experience itself of volunteering on Lesbos was a heavy experience, and it took something from me. I don't want to, I've thought about this. I don't want to be, sound melodramatic, or that, something was something that it really wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
But this work took something from me that required time to heal and get back to my normal self after.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think, the writer earns the authenticity with intent, and it gets down to a simple fact that some can and some can't in terms of being able to pull it off. But I think one of the things you're talking about, I mean, you went deeper and felt more keenly. But what I would say, as a fan and fellow writer, is that this really primary or primal impulse of bearing witness is what you were doing, among other things. But bearing witness is such a necessary, especially for dispossessed communities. And that the 20th century, of course, was the bloodiest and most brutal in recorded history, and so much poetry of witness from all over the world was written, and without that witness being bared, albeit in often poetic ways, atrocities and misfortune can be either forgotten or glossed over. So I, for one, am a big fan of no one needing permission, especially if it's coming from a place that's genuine. But I do think it's fair to say that you went a little bit deeper and stayed a little bit longer, and something beautiful came out of that. So it's a considerable achievement.
Well, thank you. I think, to try to be making something beautiful out of it, I think became a balm for me as well. Yeah. But anyway.
Was there another one from the collection you wanted to?
Sure. I did want to say something. You're talking about 20th century being the, deadliest, most violent. And that was something that was I was very cognizant of, that as, we have inherited this, those of us alive today, we've inherited this language and this continuous warfare on the planet. And, it infuses everything. It's in our, I have one poem about it. I think it's in this collection. Maybe it didn't make it in, but it's like sewn into our clothes, this kind of, the violence too of, not just the warfare, but the economic violence. And, there's a lot there's a lot it packed into that, the way we treat one another. And as you were saying, hopefully this, where we find ourselves in a world right now with this coronavirus could be something that can unify us, and help us to treat one another better. I was looking for something a little, all of the poems, as you've read the collection, Sean, so it's kind of, it's heavy all through. See if I can find something that, if I read one more that's just a little lighter. Well, I'm going to read one from the beginning of the collection because it's got a really wonderful music, which is another thing as a writer that his, that I write for, and that I find in, finally, that regardless of what I grapple with, that there is, there's, if I can, somehow in language create a music that is, that helps sustain, whatever emotion or weight there is in a work. This is the same title as the book, A Machine for Remembering. It's a machine for remembering poetry. This poem will begin momentarily. Above the skyline of the city, a minaret, an orange-yellow flash shattering glass. I lift my lips from my lover's navel, inhale her wet morning scent, the black oily smoke, alarms and sirens. These things happen not far from one another. They happen, and no actors are used in the bombing or the television's recapping of casualties as the scores of Sunday's games slide across the screen. And when I rise again and lift my head to gaze over the plain of her, the Dow Jones is up 1%, and translucent spheres are swarming her shoulders, her head, her neck. In each sphere, I see something in real life, or that I've witnessed through a screen, a girl carrying an ember on a leaf through the gray drizzle of dawn, a boy shitting in rubble, a dog sniffing and eating it, snow rocking down through the halos of streetlights, landing on the black avenue of a woman's hair. And there are more and more spheres in which I can't stop seeing a man pass his child through barbed wire, a body turning in the surf, spheres filled with nights of bombings, and in the ash trees along the river, plastic chairs and clothes, and in a building whose facade has been blown off, a family watching television, watching a boy on television write his name with a sparkler. He will never know the bombs his country spends in other places. He will never know I lay here with my lover, frightened electricity flickering in the wires of me.
Yeah, I've heard you read that one before, and I've read that several times. I think that's both, it's an epitaph for much of what you saw, but it's also an elegy for, the suffering, but the act of bearing witness and love. For everyone that will be watching this, I can't, nor do I wish to pretend to be objective. I find Justin's work, invigorating and very deep and spiritual. But I'll certainly add my 2 cents by saying that in an era where we measure our insights via tweets and Instagram, and we need that levity, and we need the bars to open so we can have a pint, but to have sustained thought and real emotional language to describe both what is and what we're trying to aspire to be. I find your work restorative and makes me want to be a better reader, makes me want to be a better writer, and makes me want to be a better person. So, I thank you, Justin, for the gifts that you've given me, and I'm very excited at the continuing opportunity to turn people who are not currently acquainted with your work on. And when I put this video on the 1455 website, I'll make sure I include some links to your webpage and of course links so people can buy these books. Any thoughts? As always, we can stop by saying to be continued. There's more discussion of craft, and our next conversation can talk a little bit more about some of the future programming that we've got planned together. But for now, I think it's a good ending on that note. I can't improve upon that poem, but by all means, any closing thoughts?
Well, I just thank you from the bottom of my heart. You're a wonderful friend and a wonderful human being. I thank you for your comments about my work, and for your close reading and thoughtfulness. You honor me. We only need one person to be audience, to be community. And so I say that to, writers out there who may not feel like they have getting the attention, or that they, their work is getting out there. We just need one person to hear what we have, written, and that can be enough. And so, Sean, thank you for honoring this work. Thank you for giving me this space here to talk to the 1455, your 1455 community that you're growing. And I don't even have the words for it, but to be involved with what you're creating is a real honor for me. I'm so proud of you as a person, and happy for you as a friend. I know it's going to be a wonderful success because you've got your heart's in the right place for this, and it's going to be terrific. And I'm just looking forward to see it growing and nurturing a community of writers.
Well, it's my pleasure. All of the above. You're welcome, and thank you. And my only ongoing request of you is I want to keep reading your work, and I want to keep building this community with you, because it's a lot funner and more gratifying to be around that table with precious friends and people that inspire you to do things you do. So I'll end by thanking you, Justin, for being here and reminding everyone that's watching, and all sincerity, a lot of the good things that are going on now can be traced directly back to this gentleman. So don't thank me, thank him. And Justin, we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Sean. Be well.
All right, my brother. Talk to you soon.
All right, man. Bye-bye.